Award-winning father-son duo Edgar Schein and Peter Schein are renowned in the organizational healthcare development space. The pair co-founded the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute and have collaborated on several books, including 2 in the Humble Leadership series. The first edition of Humble Inquiry has sold more than 200,000 copies worldwide and has been translated into 17 languages. Asking questions and actively listening to the answers is a foundational skill for everyone in the healthcare space. Unfortunately, in a world of accelerating change, we often find ourselves doing and telling rather than asking and listening. The Scheins believe our failure to ask humbly and with the right attitude has created healthcare spaces in which people do not feel psychologically safe to communicate freely, a trend that can be especially detrimental to both patients and healthcare professionals. This episode will help us not only communicate better with our patients, but with our entire healthcare team. Also, I'm now part of a network, the Doctor Podcast Network, where all of the podcasts cater to a physician audience. For instance, Dr. Jeremy Toffle hosts the Imperfect Dad MD podcast, so be sure to check it out.
Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring, a practical guide for practicing physicians. Dr. Bradley Block interviews experts in and out of medicine to find out everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. The ideas expressed on this podcast are those of the interviewer and interviewee and do not represent those of their respective employers. And now, here's Dr. Bradley Block.
Panacea Financial provides banking for doctors because it was founded by doctors. They have nationwide loan, checking, and savings options designed specifically for doctors and doctors in training. Their specialized suite of financial products gives medical students, residents, and practicing physicians greater freedom to forge their futures and at affordable rates. By reducing financial barriers and burdens, Panacea Financial ensures that all doctors have increased capacity to serve their patients and the population at large. Do you need a good home for your banking needs? Go to panaceafinancial.com, that's P-A-N-A-C-E-A, financial.com to get started. Panacea Financial is a division of Primus, member FDIC. Ed and Peter Schein, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Our pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Brad. Good to be here.
So I love the book, but a lot of it, or most of it, was about interactions in business, humble inquiry in order to help your business to thrive. So I thought it interesting that we could apply this in healthcare as well, right, to the doctor-patient relationship. So tell us how we can start applying this in addition to managing our staff, right? How we can apply this with our patients.
Well, I'll take a first crack at that historically, because it seems to me we've always been involved to some degree with medicine and healthcare, but somehow the examples in the book don't convey that. But the basic point is that we have, in the last 50 years, undergone a big transition, both in business and in medicine, from very transactional, linear, machine-like models of how organizations work. And in both domains, more in medicine than even in business, we have discovered that the actual work of doctors, nurses, techs, as well as young businesses, is now open, complex systems work, which no longer fits the machine analogy at all. And so the glib statement, it's more about relationships, which is slowly beginning to seep into businessmen's thinking, is already much farther accepted in medicine and healthcare, because I think people realize there's a huge interdependency that wasn't there in the machine age. Doctors and nurses could sort of operate independently. That's less and less true as diseases and healthcare itself become complex, simultaneously interdependent activities. So we find ourselves now more working with healthcare than with businesses. Healthcare is ahead of this field.
Well, I guess we've known for a while in healthcare that the relationship is key, right? Like your patients are going to refer their friends and colleagues if you have a good relationship with them. They're going to come back to you if you have a good relationship. They're going to actually pursue more care with you, right? If let's say you're a surgeon, you recommend surgery. If you don't have a good rapport, a good relationship, they're, in most situations, if they can, they're going to go elsewhere. So the relationship is key.
So what I would like to pick up on is to have Peter talk a little bit about what we mean by a good relationship. We use that term glibly, but society provides us some clues as to how to think about levels of relationship.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Ed. I do think that's good sort of foundation for the rest of the conversation. In Ed's humble consulting book, which came out, I think, in 2013, he described it's a sociological model of relationships, but it's really it's not culturally strange or new or different. It's something that we all sort of implicitly understand, but to really think quite intentionally and consciously about what kind of relationships we have at work and we want to cultivate at work is framed by this model. So I'll talk through it really quickly. The bottom level of relationship that we define, we call a level -1 relationship, because it is a relationship defined by people knowing what to expect of each other. But in this case, it's a negative relationship. It's dominance or exploitation. So somebody has absolute control of another person. They're able to exploit them. They're able to dominate them. That is a relationship. We consider that a level -1 relationship.
What would be an example of that?
Well, the classic example might be the sweatshop, or the guard and the prisoner, or the basic training, the drill sergeant and the enlist. But what's interesting about that example is that we know that in the military case, those relationships that are defined in that sort of level -1 are also quite intentionally going to evolve. In fact, we might argue that some of the highest performing teams that we see examples of anywhere in large, complex organizations, some of the best examples are in the military. In fact, I had an Army general comment to me. I was presenting some of this to a group at the Air Force Academy. And he said, yeah, we go from level -1, which I had described, to level 4. Well, as you'll see, as I describe the other relationships, we don't even have a level 4 in our model. So he was describing a level of closeness and intimacy that we don't even explicitly conceive of with our model. But at any rate, it captured that idea that it's quite natural to think about relationships evolving, but we start with that level -1, and then the next level is a level 1 transactional relationship. And the thing that's important about this is that when Ed was describing the machine model, really this is defined by interactions between roles, right? So we have defined specific roles. We've got very intricate job descriptions. We know what to expect of each other because the roles are well defined, and therefore the handoffs or the APIs between roles are well defined.
API.
Right. Oh, that's a Silicon Valley term. The application programming interface, but basically that means two separate things that know exactly how to interact with each other, but they don't necessarily know how to interact with each other flexibly. They have one way of interacting with each other. And in some respects, that's what level 1 means, that it's this transactional relationship. You stay in your lane, you keep your role, and you manage handoffs back and forth. And that's how the efficiency of the system is built.
Peter, let me interrupt you with 2 quick examples. Medical school was a level -1 for many years. It is now changing, but the way in which people learn to be doctors as I understood it, was very much a level -1 relationship with the senior teachers who humiliated students, who really were totally dominant over them. And the traditional doctor-patient good bedside manner was very much a level 1 transactional. The doctor stays in his professional lane, and the patient is a good patient answering questions. So in terms of medical examples, it's very clear to me how level -1 still exists, maybe in the hierarchy.
It definitely does.
Very senior people and junior people. And level 1 is sort of the traditional means. And what Peter will describe next as level 2 is where we're headed.
Right. And there's a very important idea in that. So level 2, we define as really it's a whole person to whole person personal relationship. But what we did in the Humble Leadership book is we use this term personize to distinguish it from personalize, because personalize tends to mean, personalized shopping or customness or bespoke that. What we're talking about, personalized relationships, is that you have a level of openness and trust with that other person that is truly a whole person relationship. It's not just a role-based or professionally distant relationship. Level 2 means you are shrinking the professional distance to the point that you will offer information to each other that is pertinent and may not have been asked. So think back to that doctor-patient example. If something's going on and the patient doesn't really know how to articulate it, but there is something going on, if the doctor is only able to sort of ask the questions based on the presenting symptoms, and there isn't this sort of a deeper connection, then information gets lost, or information for the doctor doesn't get captured. So the idea is in complex, work relationships or in nuanced doctor-patient relationships, can you get that level of connection between the two humans to the point where not only will the doctor be able to ask the patient and get answers, but the patient will offer answers to questions that the doctor hasn't even asked. That's what the difference between level 1 and level 2 is in our mind.
Let me give the example here that to me is the most striking one, is not doctor-patient, but doctor and the rest of the team. Because where we see the most important breakdowns in medicine is at the transactional level, handoffs, interactions, mistakes don't get picked up quickly. And the positive example is my son-in-law, who is a spine surgeon, a children's spine surgeon, who used to have a dedicated team that he would get to know. He would take them out to lunch and so on. But the economics of the situation produce a situation where he will arrive in the OR and find that the nurses and the techs and the anesthetists are all strangers. Now what? So he has discovered, I think this is credit to him, that he can use the checklist to build relationships. So he talks to the chief nurse right in the OR at the beginning and says, let's go through the checklist very slowly, looking at each of the other team members eyeball to eyeball in an inquiring way, hoping that if they have a suggestion or a question, that they'll speak up, so that by the time they've spent 5-10 minutes slowly going through the checklist, they have kind of become the beginning of a level 2 team, because he has conveyed his own interest in each of them as an individual. To me, that's a very important medical example. It's not just between doctor-patient, it's even more between doctor and the rest of the team in the whole OR and hospital setting. So with that, a couple points about level 3.
Right. So level 3 is what we really typically think of as intimacy. And usually we don't think this is something that really belongs in the workplace or in a hospital or in a healthcare system. But we quickly sort of redefine intimacy in this way around something, more like professional intimacy. And here, so in other words, we don't want to confuse the idea of sort of romantic intimacy with professional intimacy, because we think that professional intimacy is absolutely appropriate in many workplaces. And in fact, a lot of it may have to do with the intensity of the work and the complexity of the work. So we're quite sure that in a SEAL team, there's a high level of professional intimacy between those members of the SEAL team. They need to know each other really well so that they can anticipate each other's moves, so that they can, finish each other's sentences, so that they can perform at such a high level in such intense conditions. Well, that may be very true of a lot of situations in a hospital, where you do need a level of professional intimacy above and beyond just the sort of quickly established openness and trust, like Ed was describing in the surgical checklist example. So when that general referred to level 4, I'm not sure what he meant, but he clearly was espousing the idea of professional intimacy as being something very important in high complexity and life and death situations, as occurs on the battlefield or in the hospital on any given day or any given hour.
I want to throw in a medical example there. In this research that was done with a new cardiac open heart procedure that a colleague of ours, Amy Edmondson at Harvard, studied, where 2 sets of hospitals were studied, some of which adopted the procedure and some of which rejected the procedure. And she was trying to figure out why there would be the difference. Couldn't find anything in the ecology or the hospitals or the size or anything, but discovered that in those groups that rejected the procedure, the senior cardiac surgeon had said, "This is a professional job. I want the best people." And he assigned people to each of the roles, anesthesia, et cetera, et cetera. They then tried the procedure, doing it by the book, discovered that they really couldn't do it, too many surprises, and concluded this is too complicated, we're not ready. Okay, fair enough. So what's going on in these other groups? So what Amy found in interviewing, the senior cardiac surgeons, is that they said, I want some volunteers. This might be complicated. Who wants to work with me? So right off the bat, you've got a very different relationship starting. Instead of the senior surgeon assigning people, asking for volunteers. Then he took them out to lunch to get to know them. Then they collectively decided, this is going to be complicated, so let's find ourselves a simulator and see how much of this we can simulate. They then discovered all the things that could go wrong in this new procedure and began to get close to this level 3, getting to know each other, so that when they finally hit the real patients, they were ready. They knew what each other was going to do. They understood the process, and they found it possible to use this new procedure. To me, that's a very important study to show how the doctor's attitude toward the rest of the team can build these relationships to a very high level if the task is very complex.
Brad, we like to describe well, most organizations, but certainly, medical systems as socio-technical systems where it's an intrinsically combined, highly technical, but also highly human. And I think Ed's example is one where the technical problem could have been solved, but what made it effective was that the socio side of it was resolved early or was optimized early so that the technical throughput wasn't going to be as challenging because these very adaptive human beings, as we all are, were able to kind of figure out how to make the technical system really work.
Well, it seems to me that the difference there is that the team got to know each other so well that there was a free flow of communication. And so that way, at any point, any person in the team felt free to communicate with any other member of the team. Whereas if it's the first time doing this procedure, everyone's looking to the physician to make all of the decisions, which ultimately we bear all, there are two physicians, there's the anesthesiologist and the surgeon, but bear all of the responsibility for what happens. And so then they defer all the decisions, even though they might see or notice something. So I think to your point, and Ed, with your son-in-law and the checklist, developing that relationship such that there's a free flow of communication. And we've seen that right with pilots, right? If it's in a place where there's a co-pilot who's subordinate to the pilot, they're reluctant to describe if they see a problem. And then this can, even if they do notice a legitimate problem, maybe they tell it too late or they don't say it at all. And now you've run into trouble.
Right.
So it seems to me just a mechanism for allowing free flow of information and communication.
Right. And those cockpit examples are really painful because they usually involve life and death. We had one here in 2013 at SFO. And there's the famous one with I think it was a Colombian airline. It was a translation problem, but it also truly was sort of a hierarchy problem. And that's a lot of what we're really trying to get at.
And that's medicine.
The term that's being used now, and it's been around for a while, but it's something that really has to be imprinted in people's minds, is how of creating psychological safety so that particularly in situations where it's life and death, if you see something, you say something. If you hear something, if you feel something, you have to be able to speak up. You have to have that psychological safety to say what's going on. It's a lot of what we say in the preface to the Humble Inquiry book is that a lot of what we're trying to get at is to try to kind of pry open intent and consciousness so that people will really be able to get at what's going on. So much of our work and our conversation is kind of bounded by these roles that we're playing. We're trying to say with humble inquiry and establishing open and trusting relationships, you get to the point where you have a broader contextual sense of what's really going on. Because again, if it's life and death, you're going to want to know what's really going on. You're not wanting to stay in these bounded, structured sort of information exchanges. You need to have information sharing.
Medicine is extraordinarily hierarchical, right? And one example is the fact that I'm the attending, I'm doctor. You call me Dr. Block. Everyone calls me Dr. Block. Everyone else is called by their first name. So this establishes this hierarchy. Would you recommend that then physicians go by their first names, right? Would this start to break down barriers like that? Because now it's done because in the patient, right, doctor-patient relationship, we're trying to also establish that dynamic, right? I'm not Mr. Block, I'm not Brad, I'm Dr. Block, right? And then that permeates the rest of the medical establishment. There's the doctors and then there's everyone else who goes by their first name. So would you recommend that we all go by our first names?
I think that's oversimplifying the reality that the hierarchy is still there. People do know, particularly in medicine, but also in any organization, that even when relations get very informal between the boss and the subordinate, that the boss still has accountability and still has the power to make or break the people below her. So I think the trick of developing these level 2 relationships and beyond is to be relevantly informal, not necessarily in some kind of arbitrary mechanical way. Because the reality that the patient may still prefer to be able to say Dr. So-and-so and be able to trust that person in a different way than everyone else or the interns or the others who are standing around. That doesn't mean that the minute they're outside the door, that they don't then address each other informally. But I think one of the problems in working with these hierarchies is that the temptation is to ignore the socio-tech side and just work the technical side. So there are all these improvement programs which talk about the hierarchy and the processes and how to have huddles and how to be more informal, but they are all derivative from an engineering technical kind of culture and don't sufficiently say, well, once we're in the huddle or when the doctor is handing off an important patient to the ICU nurse, at those times, they have to be able to be level 2 at least. So it's partly not to have blanket rules for all doctors and all nurses, but to have a sensitivity to what's going on here. And if I'm handing off this complicated surgical patient to the ICU, to be able to say to the nurse, now here are some special conditions that you got to be aware of, that we became aware of during the surgery. And at that moment, that nurse has to feel psychologically safe to say, Doc, I don't understand. Or, that what you wrote out in the written stuff didn't communicate. At those points, I think it becomes critical, and humble inquiry then becomes the vehicle to say, I don't understand. Can you tell me more? Or the doctor actually saying to the tech or the nurse, do you understand? Have I been clear? It's got to be situational, not some general rule.
But to your point, Brad, there's another principle that I think comes into that idea, that to say, don't refer to me as Dr. Block, refer to me as Brad, is you may then be signaling what we believe is really important, and that is embracing the idea of here and now humility. That when we say humble inquiry, humble leadership, humble consulting, all of these books, what we define humble as is not some character trait, right? If you're a world-renowned, thoracic surgeon, you're probably not. I mean, this is not fair for me to say, but that's a really hard position to get to. And you may have been very driven and personally motivated, selfishly driven, and you may not come across as the most humble person, right? You may be quite arrogant. That's okay. You're a world-class thoracic surgeon. It's that may conform to people's expectations very well. However, in any given situation, embracing the idea of here and now humility, anybody's capable of doing that. It just means sort of, stepping outside yourself for a second and saying, this is a new situation. There's a bunch of complicated factors. There's a bunch of other people here who know what's going on. And I need to impress to them that I want them to tell me what's going on. I don't want to be the all-knowing, omniscient, omnipotent, thoracic surgeon. I want to be the doctor who brings this group together because it's a really complicated case, and I need to know what they know. I don't need to show what I know. I need them to tell me what they know. And that's what humble inquiry, the spirit of humble inquiry, is all about.
So what are some examples of what we can do? Because, some of these are long-term relationships, but some of these aren't, right? Like sometimes you're on the same shift as someone, they're only going to be there for a couple of weeks or even for a couple of days, right? Like, how do we send these signals that we're approachable, that we want their input, that we want to know their opinion, that we want to signal to them that we will non-judgmentally, receive their information?
Well, the simplest thing is to use the skills we use outside of work when we want to be informal with friends or relatives. We put on a different face. We ask questions. We say, how's it going today? We make a personal remark about, it's been a hard day, hasn't it? There are a zillion ways we know how to be informal, but there's somehow the norm has grown up that at work, we have to put on our formal transactional self and not to use these very simple devices where I can imagine you as a doctor meeting a new charge nurse might actually make a comment about her or ask her, where are you from? With that tone. I don't think it's mysterious. I think it's more that we're scared to actually be a little bit here and now humble. We don't want to give up that authority position. And yet, if we're really, I think the key is to recognize you are dependent on those people. So it's in your interest to be a little bit more open and informal with them. Not to be nice, but to get them to tell you what you need to know. And maybe that dependence is sometimes invisible. And yet it's terribly important that you recognize as the doctor how much you depend on them, not only to do the right thing, but to tell you when you are not doing the right thing or when they don't understand or whatever. I don't think it's so mysterious.
So it's like when I was single and I used to, try to approach someone in the bar. So where are you from? Or I like your earrings or something like that.
Exactly.
Well, but that brings up a really important point, though, is that human beings have pretty good bullshit radars.
Yeah.
And so if you're trying to do this with, a tech or a nurse who you don't have any relationship with, and it comes across as insincere, it may even be worse than not trying at all. And so we've kind of developed some sort of key ideas that you really have to buy into, or it comes across as bullshit. So you really do have to gut check, do I care? If I'm going to ask, if I believe that I need to develop a closer relationship, I have to care where the person's from. I actually have to be genuinely curious. I cannot just go through these questions because it's transparent. People know that. If you're just going through these questions, again, these are not pickup lines at a bar. You have to communicate some sincerity when you go through this. But then I think the other thing, the reason that's maybe the humility part, you have to be willing to ask questions you don't know the answer to, right? And then, but you also have to really train yourself to deeply listen. maybe even get to an awkward silence, because you asked somebody an open-ended question and you let them go until you arrived at that moment of awkward silence. If you do that, then maybe you realize you really are both opening up to establishing a relationship. It's very easy to kind of bounce back to the next sort of diagnostic question. But what we're suggesting is that getting to that sort of that moment of awkwardness where you really are opening up, you're inquiring to the point of awkwardness. But then one way you get through that is you reveal something about yourself. And that starts to build that sort of circular empathy. And if you can get to that within 5 minutes, and we know it's possible, the whole speed dating idea wouldn't have ever existed if we didn't think we could get to that, and that's not even 5 minutes, right? So anyway, that's sort of the general idea. Even in the shortest interactions, it's possible to do this, but you have to really train yourself to care, to step outside of yourself a little bit, to care enough, because that caring comes through loud and clear.
So we've talked a lot so far about the professional relationships, with the other professionals in the healthcare setting. But can we talk a little about the doctor-patient relationship? Because humble inquiry, similar to what you just said, right? Like, we have to genuinely care. You have to ask an open-ended question. You have to let them actually complete the thought. But tick, 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 right? We're on a schedule. We're not lawyers. We don't bill by the hour as much as I'd like to. And then, let people talk for as long as they, and they would appreciate it too. But that's just not how the system is designed. Right. So how do we apply humble inquiry during the visits efficiently?
Well, the example I use that may be completely unrealistic, but nevertheless, I think it's an important example, is you only have 10 minutes or 20 minutes for the visit. It's highly structured. You don't want to be late and so on. I don't see any reason why the doctor can't come charging in. The patient's been sitting there waiting, is irritated at having to put that stupid Johnny on. Why the doctor can't come in with a smile on his face and say, well, I'm only a little bit late, and we're both bound by this new system of I only got 20 minutes, but let's see if we can make the best use of it. Big smile on his face. Let's start with what's worrying you most. I don't see any reason why a doctor can't start the relationship that way. Instead of coming in formally, holding the chart, picking up the chart, reading the chart, maintaining distance, all of that is unnecessary. He or she can come in and say, let's get started. We've only got 20 minutes, and ask an open question like, what's worrying you, Ed?
I think part of what we always want to remind ourselves, and by inference other people in this, is that it's kind of embracing the shared context. Neither of you can change that fact that, you're a family practice doctor and you've probably got 1,000 patients, I don't know, give or take, and you've probably got to see 20 people that day. Embracing that context would probably be really helpful for the patients. The patients don't need to somehow believe that they're the one of two visits the doctor has that day. They know they're not, and so in general, there's this idea of we can be so quickly drawn into the content of why we're there, and sort of sort of an unwillingness to embrace the context of that situation. That sort of situational awareness or contextual awareness, I just think is so important, and it gets overlooked all the time.
So I think what I'm hearing is using an icebreaker, right? Like something that's relevant to the situation that you both will find either interesting or funny. And you start off the visit with that rather than, why are you here? Some other more peripheral thing that leads into why are you here?
That goes straight to the content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The key is to use the word we right from the beginning.
Why are we here?
Why are we here?
Hopefully they won't answer with something more metaphysical.
Or to say not why are we here, but to acknowledge we are both here in a system that gives us too little time. So let's make the most of it. But getting it to we as quickly as possible, I think, is another clue.
I also think there's this idea of what's efficient and what's effective. We get so caught up in the efficiency of all of these things that we're trying to do. It's analogous to being seduced by the content of what we're trying to do, and recognize that sometimes the most effective interventions parked all of the noise and really got quickly to the signal of what's going on. And in your profession, there's a lot of noise that you have to kind of try to cut through to get to what's really going on. Well, maybe that truly sort of humble inquiry question of, what's worrying you? Why are we here today?
Well, so
it's
what's
completely
worrying you?
Open-ended.
What's worrying you? That's a great lead into what's going to be my last question, which is often patients have what I call the question behind the question, which is the thing that they're not asking. So for me, an example is, I see this all the time. Patients come in with a symptom called globus. It's a lump. You feel like there's a lump in your throat. And so most of them think, I have throat cancer. And so the question is, I've got this lump in my throat, and they tell the story. That's why they're here. They're here describing their symptom. The question behind the question is, Doc, do I have cancer? Do I have throat cancer? And so I find it critically important to name that, right? And if they've left without you verbally making it very clear, you do not have throat cancer. What I just did during this evaluation was a thorough evaluation that includes looking for this specific diagnosis. You don't have it. So how can we utilize humble inquiry to make sure that we are getting what they're worried about, right? You said, what are you worried about? How do we make sure that we're not only addressing the symptom that they're describing, but their underlying concerns?
Well, I think this idea of what is worrying you is not a casual thought. I think over the years, we both learned that in conversations, the technical gets all the attention. What are your symptoms, what's hurting, where, and so on, because the patient is also trained that that's what the doctor wants to hear about. So I think even a question of, so the patient starts with, I've got this lump, even the question right then and there, is that really a concern? Would open the door right away. Not just to say, well, tell me more about the lump. You say, why are you concerned about it? Lumps occur in throats. To shift to the social part of the sociotech, to the emotional part. And I don't think doctors are maybe trained enough to ask about, so you've got this throat lump, how does that make you feel? Or why does that worry you? Is a whole category of questions that are personalized and emotionally charged and social that gets you past the technical stuff. And I think that's possible to do that. And good doctors do that all the time. When a pediatrician who was a pediatrician to Peter was once asked to come to our house because Peter had a high fever. I don't know, he was 4 or 5. And the first thing this pediatrician did was to take a look at Peter, who was lying there scared to death. And the pediatrician said, "Peter, you're not going to die." That was a classic example of empathy on the part of the pediatrician before any questions, just like your example of saying to the patient, you don't have cancer.
Oh, I think that's great. And with pediatricians, there are two patients in the room, right? There's the patient and then there's a parent. So addressing both of them and saying, is this concerning to you? Why is this concerning to you? I think, we'd probably get some entertaining answers out of the kids too, right? And then there's going to be great context. Why is this worrying you? I'm worried I'm going to miss my baseball game. I'm worried I'm going to miss a birthday party. I'm worried.
Exactly.
And then, that opens up such a great opportunity for that relationship building with that kid.
Exactly.
Because they might not say, I'm worried I'm going to die. They're worried about video games or whatever, kids.
So the punchline on that story, by the way, Brad, is that was T. Barry Brazelton, the famous pediatrician who really, I think, became very well known for his ability to build relationships with his patients, not just the parents, but with the kids.
Yeah. And to me, I see a lot of kids. That's where the joy really comes from. It's from those relationships with the kids, and then those kids go on to be adults.
Right.
So, well, this has really been, I would say, transformative in the way that it'll help us interact with our partners, our staff, the hospital staff, our patients. So where can people find more about you both, Ed and Peter, and the books and the company at OCLI?
Yeah. So the book that we've mostly been talking about is Humble Inquiry, the second edition. And so that's available everywhere, but Amazon's probably the easiest. And our organization is the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute, which is really just a partnership between Ed and I. We gave it a fancy name, but it does have a website, ocli.org. and that has more information about us. It has information about some of our other work. We do a lot of work in organizational culture. These things are very closely related, but it's sort of a separate thread. So if people are interested in that, we love talking about that as well.
Great.
Well, and I would just add that we have one relationship with a large hospital system where, under the umbrella of improvement, they have decided that just giving the book to a lot of people and then building group discussions around the book is a very effective intervention. So the book itself, even though it's got this business bias, cuts through pretty quickly to the human side. And you might just experiment with handing the book out to a couple of colleagues and see how they react to it.
We also, at the end of the second edition, we put in some sort of we call them mini case studies, but they're basically little exercises that you can go through and just sort of test for yourself. There's no right answers generally on this, but we provide some examples of how you might respond in these situations in order to sort of tease out what would humble inquiry be here versus diagnostic inquiry or confrontational inquiry. And so it does sort of bring some of the book to life a little bit more, and it might give you sort of a fun way to tease this out a little bit. We hate to say you must read the whole book, but these exercises are actually pretty worthwhile and pretty useful in just sort of getting into the mindset.
Yeah. How would I apply it versus how I should be applying it, and help me change my thinking with some real examples.
Right. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Well, it's been a pleasure I have to take off. So I'm going to say thank you for giving us a chance, because we do think it's very important in the healthcare area to get this across.
Well, thank you very much both for your time. And again, ocli.org.
Yep.
OCLI.net will take you to ophthalmologic consultants of Long Island that are a bunch of eye doctors near me. So OCLI.org and Humble Inquiry. Thank you so much, Peter and Ed Schein, for your time.
Thank you so much, Brad. It was a really good discussion.
Oh, and by the way, don't forget to reach out to Panacea Financial for your banking needs as a physician because they are built by physicians. Panacea's PRN personal loan was designed specifically for physicians and physicians in training. Go to panaceafinancial.com, that's PANACEA, financial.com, and open your new account today. Panacea Financial is a division of Primus, member FDIC.
That was Dr. Bradley Block at the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. He can be found at physiciansguidetodoctoring.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a question for a previous guest or have an idea for a future episode, send a comment on the webpage. Also, please be sure to leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next time on the Physician's Guide to Doctoring.